Hi, I'm Jeff Zakarski,
And I'm Jason Primrose.
and welcome to Gentlemen, the #1 podcast for open-hearted leadership.
That's right. If you want more in the form of community, you can find us anywhere: Facebook, Instagram, YouTube for the video versions, and Clubhouse just by searching Gentlemen, 2 words, the podcast. Whew, I just got chills even about to say, let's talk about inclusivity.
Yeah.
I remember when I saw this pillar on the list of pillars that we wanted to address that became the Men Commandments. I still like that. And figuring out where it came in the order of our episodes. And it's really interesting because we just finished talking about trust and faith with Pastor Kevin Francis, and he was talking a lot about inclusivity in the church, having spaces where people can be their entire selves. And so I think that's a really important conversation to have, especially from someone who feels like I haven't been my entire self. Part of it were my own patterns and choices, and part of it is like kind of the system that we exist in. But I also have found it really interesting that, and this is something that I've asserted on social media, is that like inside of like any sort of white supremacist system, no one gets to be themselves. And so I'm curious actually to hear how like you've felt challenge in your being inside of what inside of kind of like what was expected of you in terms of that like hierarchical system.
Yeah. Well, I want to start and say that I probably spent most of my life not recognizing that there was, right? Like being um a white privileged like came from a good household, like parents like made great money, um, you know, definitely was a little bit of a melting pot of like high school and stuff like that. But I even think by the time I got to high school was the first time that I even really started noticing it, which was strange because as a kid, I had, the person that lived behind me was African American and like my best friend, like, and like from a child perspective, like didn't see any of that, like, um, didn't recognize it, or whether I maybe it's I didn't have self-awareness around it. Either way, the fast forward piece of it is I went through most of my life like recognizing that I perceive there to be a difference, but not being willing to actually put myself into conversations to really understand what it was like. And I just felt like, oh well, I'm not racist, I'm doing my part, like whatever that meant at that time. And what I've really what I can fast forward through today is actually realizing how that me um standing outside of the inclusivity and standing outside of the racism conversations and standing outside of the discomfort was me kind of enabling that structure, that, and just like allowing it to exist is kind of what's the word? I don't have all the words here, so bear with me as I try to, speak about this, because even today it's something that I still feel somewhat challenged in talking about, because um I I am committed to making a difference with the inclusivity and to breaking up a lot of the white supremacist structures, and being a voice, being an ally, doing my best to understand and all of that. And a lot of that is even outside of what I know. So if I allow that to be where I stop, oh, well, I don't know, I'm not sure I can trust myself, right? Bringing our last pillar in, I don't know who to be in this situation. So if I stop there, I'm actually no further along than I was willing to go before. Um, and so where I am, and let's see if I can come back to the question, because you were talking about my experience of it, and I thought that maybe by giving a little bit of like, hey, this is how I've gotten to this point. This is where I come from. This is also why I believe it's inside of me as a commitment, as a responsibility to stand up for some of this stuff. But you know, um, I still find myself in conversations when that's myopically what we come down on. I still find myself uncomfortable. I find myself worried that I'm going to say the wrong thing. I find myself asking more questions and listening, but from a place of that's comfortable for me. Asking somebody questions and being like, I'm great like that. I could sit in a chair with you and actually just listen to anybody all day long. Like that's something that's very much in my comfort zone. What's not in my comfort zone is challenging things where I see injustices. What's not in my comfort zone is having challenging conversations in relationships that have been around the majority of my life. And in the past where somebody made like a racist crack or somebody made some like anti-Semitic, hope I said that right. Semitic. Thank you. Comment, I'm like, ha ha ha, like that was funny, and actually like perpetuate that. And I had a recent experience that I think is probably valuable to talk about here, which was being in an environment with some friends and watching a conversation between a black man and a white man. Me like observing this to start and the um, hearing the black man represent his experience. The conversation was around like uh, because you grew up in a predominantly white community, you didn't experience racism. Like that was the thing that kicked it off, and my eyes just like blew up because of like a lot of the work that I'm doing. I know that that's not true. I don't know overall at a high level like what the actual impact was or all of the little minute things, but I know that that's a false statement. And in that moment, um, I came right up against that same thing. Oh, do I kind of like laugh this off or do I stay silent? Or do I just chalk this up to the camaraderie around what's going on? But what I recognized in that moment that it wasn't in service of anybody for me to stay silent in that moment. And that took it actually took an enormous amount of courage for me to start speaking because I didn't know what I was going to say. And I think that's a lot of the time, that's a lot of the places where I stop. It's like, well, I don't know what to say. So I'm going to sit here quiet in the corner and I'm going to try and figure it out. But this moment, I actually, um, I actually believed that it was more important for me to share my belief, my experience, and also be an ally in the moment than it was to let it kind of get swept under the rug one more time. And it blew the F up. Like it was wildly more it was wildly more explosive than I was anticipating it on. And some of that is I got to own, like there was a lot of energy, there was a lot of like not groundedness from me being in that conversation. There was a lot of fear for me, but that was my own stuff. But I was willing to put that down. But the I ended up getting into an argument with my friend who's another white male who was not listening, who wasn't hearing, who was discounting and being really nonchalant, like, yeah, it didn't really happen. And I was just like, it did. Like it did and it does and it's continuing. And if the um if and I had to point that out. I actually reflected that out. And it was the conversation was at a point, when you argue with somebody and like at some point in the argument you're not actually arguing about the thing, like everybody's in their defense and it's just it's like you started an argument about like whatever oranges, and now you're talking about how someone's stupid, right? It's like the two things don't actually jive, and that's actually where this got to. It got to a place where um, uh, the person that I was having a conversation with was such in their defense that they were hurling uh, insults back at me, and like, talk about, again, like something to be with, like having somebody that you've known for a long time like actually hurling insults that you know are not true. But what was amazing about the conversation is I was able to actually realize that that's what was happening. That was the real beautiful thing in that experience for me, was to see that the that where it had gotten to in the conversation wasn't actually about what the conversation was about, which allowed me to do a couple things, which I think is actually a growth area for me, which it wouldn't have happened had I not actually chosen to speak up without knowing what was actually going to happen. So I was able to observe the defense in this other white man, and I was able to hold compassion for the fact that they were in their defense, and I was able to stay grounded for the most part with myself, but I was able to still stay in the content of the conversation that we were originally having, which was around that, yes, it did happen, and yes, that person making jokes of it was a way of, I'm probably making an assumption here, but since it's like based on human behavior, is like laughing things off is a way of like trying to put it to the side and trying to reduce the meaning of it, like that it is for me. So I'm assuming that happened in this. But I even saw this where it's like, oh, it's not that big of a deal. Like there's something to making it not that big of a deal. And that's the thing that actually really got to me, because it actually is a really big deal. And if we've seen anything for the last year, it's been a big deal for a very long time, and it's going to continue to be a big deal. So let's see where I want to wrap this up. And then, yeah, totally open to any questions as well. But the I believe that it is. I believe it's my job as a white person to help dismantle white supremacy. Like, I think that's basically it. I believe that it's my responsibility to speak up. I believe that staying silent and complicit is being complicit and pretending that it's not happening, and that it's not a thing, and that it's not a big deal, and I'm just not willing to do that. And this is one of the probably the most uncomfortable moments that was in around this kind of conversation with people that I love and care about, and willing to go there. So if it taught me anything, it it feels like, I mean, like I can go head to head, toe to toe on it, and not know how it's actually going to go, if that makes sense. I think it's like, I'm willing to step in. I'm willing to speak up. I'm willing to, and I'm capable of it. That's one thing that I learned. I'm like, things that came out of this conversation is, um, I can get back into relationship with people from breakdowns. 2, I can stand for it. 3, um, I can state my beliefs very powerfully and adamantly, and I can stay outside other people's stuff, which I think is really important in some of these conversations around inclusivity and racism, because they're people have a lot of beliefs, and they have beliefs about themselves inside those paradigms. And at the end of the day, if somebody's belief gets pushed up against or triggered, or they feel wrong or something like that, they're going to get in their defense. So, but that's not an excuse, in my opinion, to not talk about it, to not stand up for it, to not voice about it. So yeah, I recognize, like, in this conversation, in even an earlier conversation we had, I recognize that, like, there's something to where my voice is sitting in my throat that is different than a conversation that we had earlier. And I know that usually when I'm a little bit nervous, like, that's actually what happens. Like, it's almost like my voice recoils a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm very committed to staying very present in this conversation.
Yeah. Wow. Um, uh, there's a lot, there's a lot in there. Um, I mean, I definitely want to acknowledge your courage in speaking up in that moment, um, and your ability to separate uh, someone's being from your own,
Mm-hmm.
so that you could continue to move forward with what you were committed to, which was
Mm-hmm.
like owning the fact that this person's experience is what it is or was what it was.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Um, and that was more important to you than keeping the peace or the vibe of the evening, um, which I think is very powerful. Knowing you, I know that that's a huge moment and a huge step. Um, it's interesting too about your friend, the one that was is black. And I also want to just tell the audience that like inclusivity for us is not just about like race, but there's all kinds of
Mm-hmm.
things. There's religion, there's sexuality, there's
Totally.
socioeconomics. Like there's all kinds of levels of inclusivity. And I think when we talk to Bruce, we'll get actually like a
Mm.
global sense of it,
Nice.
um, because he's actually working on an international Black Heritage Day.
Mm.
But you know, for me, I'm at an intersectionality, and that's not something people talk about a lot, which is like the intersectionality of being black and gay. But there's all
Mm-hmm.
kinds of things like that start to knock you down on the rung of like white supremacy. So if you keep if it were like a ladder, you know, we would have like straight white men. Um, I think there's like some level of like gay white men and white women competition up there, especially if
Mm.
you're straight passing.
Mm.
So there's all kinds of things that like start to meld together. But I think what's interesting is the what I did and what I do in terms of protection. And so what I've always thought was the right thing to do was to shield my relationships from the trauma of me being a gay black man existing in spaces where maybe I wasn't necessarily meant to be. Um, and so that has me not talking about, um, it has me not addressing jokes that may be offensive to me, or it has me not speaking up about places where I'm uncomfortable or things that I can't do. Like I don't know if we talked about this, but I talked about it with Tyler. Was like because I have a lot of friends that are affluent. Um, Me being able to be honest about like where I am socioeconomically in relation to like whatever it is that we're doing, whether it's going to dinner or taking a vacation, right? Um,
Mm.
so where like my like systemic position backs up against my relationships. Um, and so I found myself a lot of times um, having the same level of difficulty as you having those conversations, like having the
Mm.
courage to speak up about what my experience has been or is. Um, and I remember last year, a lot of people reaching out to ask me, like, because I never talk about it. So they were like, well, have you? And like, what do you feel? And like, what is it that's going on with you? And I was like, I honestly haven't stopped to check in with myself and like feel how I feel about this. And I remember when I watched, and I don't watch the police videos. I don't think that it, what I'll say is that you won't see often any other type of person where there will be videos of them being killed. That's just not something you would see. Um, so I don't support the distribution of media that like shows the harm. I think it's jarring and it's shocking, but it can also be desensitizing in such quantities.
Mm.
So But I did watch the George Floyd murder. Um, and I watched it after it had been going on for 2 weeks, like all of the conversations, and I was so mad. I was so mad because I couldn't believe that someone would actually, like I didn't believe that someone would actually like lean on someone's neck in that way when they weren't defending themselves. Um and then my first thought was like, wow, that could be me, huh?
Mm.
I'm so sorry. Notifications were off. Um but I thought that could be my father, that could be my cousin, it could be my uncle, like um and so that woke up something inside of me, and it was like, there's something I'm not looking at here. There's something I'm not looking at here. Like, my proximity to whiteness has been very close for a very long time, so much so that I'm not actually looking at like how I exist inside of that dynamic. And when I started to get really clear, some of my relationships started to change too. Um, and so, to bring this back to what you said, I think that when your friend brought it up, just like now when I bring it up, it can be surprising because people might assume that racism doesn't touch me for some reason. Like, I would not be discriminated against because maybe of your personal relationship with me, or something like that. But let me just be very clear that it does, and it has. Um, and I have purposefully existed in spaces where I felt safe, and I know we talked about safety before, because I have been like nervous about, like, living in Alexandria, a very safe place, suburbs. Richmond was a little bit jarring, but the protection of the college was there, the university. I chose to move straight to LA. I've never lived in the South. I've been there a couple times with white friends. Um, you know, um, and so I've been to Europe. I feel safe there. And so it's so in terms of like, um, around the conversation of inclusivity, uh, like what Kevin was saying last week, it's like, how can we create spaces where people feel safe to be themselves,
Mhm.
their complete selves, not the selves that you want them to be, right?
Right.
Um, and then part of the work that I feel like I get to do is like being inclusive of me in whatever space that I'm in, which means that I get to
Mhm.
show up as like my full self, not a like dulled down version of me for conformity purposes. And that means that if I hear something, I get to speak about it,
Mhm.
rather than try to hide it so that I don't seem like problematic, which I think is something that
Mm.
I know that's something that I've always considered. Um, and I remember, this is going to take too long to go into, but I remember when we had the conversation about one of our guests, and I was really upset about not knowing, um, where that person stood, politically, because I felt like the conversation that we would have had would have been different. We could have addressed some really powerful things. Um, and I think even in that moment, I wasn't feeling courageous enough to take it on. And I also know that I guess I had hoped that like you would.
Mhm.
Um, and so this comes back to like a bigger conversation around like, where are the places that we're willing to step into these conversations where we don't necessarily feel safe, and it's not with people that or comfortable with, that we may have like, for me, that I might have hierarchical dynamics with people that I think are better than me, more successful, or whatever the case may be, or maybe outside of like the sphere of like, if we have this conversation, what will happen to the relationship? Um, because that's like the next place for me to go,
Mm.
is like being really a stand for what inclusivity means in this world, um, and that everyone gets to have a place, to exist and be themselves, no matter how uncomfortable, um, I guess I get in the process.
Jason, thanks for sharing all of that, and thanks for being vulnerable about what it's like to be on that side of the conversation. Coming from the place of being like a white man, it's like I do my best to listen to the experience of what's on the other, what somebody else is experiencing, but I never still fully get it. And even when I shared in my conversation a bit earlier about like what it was like for me in that situation to be in a conversation with my my friends, like the conversation I was even in is like, how do I show up in this conversation? What does me showing up fully in in that specific conversation look like? And what I'm really present to after hearing you share your experience is that in that situation, me getting ready to like speak up fully or be what I was considering to be fully expressed in that situation, um, I wasn't in any real danger. Like I was with people that I trusted, and like even though the conversation went a certain way that I didn't actually foresee it going, like I was okay. And what I really get is that it's a different experience for some people to actually bring that level of radical honesty about what it's like to be them and what it's like to be in the experience of somebody else who diminishes and demeans um, other people, and like and how challenging it is to speak up in that case. So I really like I honor the, I think that's actually a really good word for it. I really honor the trust and continuing to put yourself out there, because I do know that like you don't actually know how it's going to go when you do that. And that's also, you know, part of the reason why I chose in that situation to like, I don't actually know how this is going to go. And I think, you know, outside of this specific conversation about being inclusivity, which I think is really important, I think as a general rule of thumb, that's why most people don't feel like they can be fully expressed, because they're up against something that they're scared about. And in some cases, it feels dangerous. When it's not actually really that dangerous. It's just like our hearts are exposed and our vulnerability exposed, and that feels scary. But I think it's also really important to draw the distinction between what it's like to be in a situation where there's not actually any real danger, like long term like danger or anything, and what it's like to actually
Mm-hmm.
be in a situation where that shit is real. Um, and so I really
Yeah.
want to distinguish that, and especially being practiced at trying to to make that point, um, as a white man, in service of other people, at least giving themselves the opportunity to take a look at that for themselves, and how they show up in that conversation where they can simply um, be okay by not saying anything. Like they have the privilege to actually be able to do that. There actually is no danger, and there's no responsibility for them to make a conversation about that. But in this case, like we do have a responsibility. Um, and I do believe that, you know, what continues to come up for me as a result of this conversation is to really get present to my own edges with my comfort zone when it comes to speaking up more in service of inclusivity, whether it be race related, religion related, you know, the stuff that's happening over in Israel, whether it's which I'm fully own, like I'm still not, I don't feel like an expert around it, nor will I ever be, but like, you know, it's my, but I have an opportunity to bring a voice to that kind of stuff anyway, and I have an opportunity and almost I feel like an obligation to learn as to be able to speak to some of that stuff. So that was a little bit long winded, um, but that's what's coming up for me. And I guess if I were to bottom line that down, is like it's important. It's really important to address the issues that are pushing against inclusivity, that are creating systems that, by their nature, are inherently minimizing or diminishing to who people are as a human with all of the uniquenesses that is who they are. And again, that's race and religion and sexual orientation and people's simply preference for how they want to live their lives and how they want to be alive and how they want to express themselves. So does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think it goes beyond. I mean, it just goes beyond. I mean, a lot of the stuff we're talking about even is structural identity,
Mm-hmm.
which is something I have a complicated relationship with because they are all constructs of a reality that we've created
Yep.
ourselves. So I know this is like my science fiction brain, but it's true. Like, you know, race is something we made up. Like, it's something that we made up to qualify
Mm-hmm.
people. Nationality is more of like a regional experience, like of people that share a specific set of
Mm-hmm.
values. And race is basically all people that are all the same color, which is like not really a thing. So if you go to any other country, they may identify as like Afro something or whatever the case may be, Chinese American or but um, but there are places where nationality supersedes any sort of racial
Mm-hmm.
conversation. And I've had conversations with people in Europe, and they're like, we don't we don't have a race box that we check when we go get cable or sign up for a cell
Mm-hmm.
phone. Like I don't have to tell you that I'm
Right.
white, or whatever. And Europeans may not even consider themselves
Mm-hmm.
that. Um, but yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, I think in all of this stuff and with sexuality, I think it's a spectrum, and the need to like identify or like name it is part of that like needing to know so that there's structure and like all of those
Mm-hmm.
things. So um, and with the Israel conflict, I spoke to a Jewish a person I have a relationship with that is Jewish that I don't actually know very well. So, and in that situation, it wasn't about me needing to speak about it. It was really about me needing to listen to hear the perspective of someone that's been there, has family there, knows about it, um, and has real like heart, um, has real stake, I guess, in the outcome, even from a family perspective. So, uh, I think sometimes. Well, maybe it's different because for me, I'm like, well, when do I speak up? How do I speak up? And then, in support of what's the greater vision. Um, and so I feel like I can only do that by listening to people from, you know, that have that are familiar. Um, and I actually don't know any Palestinians, but there are plenty of clubhouse rooms that have been going around where people have been having discussions about it with both as I guess Israelis and Palestinians in there. So yeah, it's been yeah, inclusivity just runs so many threads, and the more we I guess use these distinctions to separate each other and create hierarchical structures, it's the less likely we are to be inclusive.
Mm-hmm.
We use them as weapons. We use differences as weapons
Yeah.
against people.
Yeah. Yeah. It becomes something that we can qualify in order to separate.
Mm-hmm.
separate, or to create some sort of distance. I think, in some sense, um, and anytime there's that kind of distance, there's an inherent power dynamic to the situation, and um, I think a lot of people fight, or fight might not be the right word, but it's the idea of like looking to restore balance, or like again, balance might not, it's the equality aspect of it, where you see people as whole, and it doesn't matter, there's no need for the check boxes, there's no need for like treating people as something other than simply who they are in the world, regardless of like anything that somebody could qualify, and I think it's like, you're right, I mean, it's been done for so long, so it's like, okay, so then it's like, what's next, right? It's like, it's important to me to recognize what has happened. It's important for me to like get in touch with where we are now, and it's also important for me to get in touch with who I am willing to and committed to being moving forward. Because if we, the general we, continue to show up as we have, then we can predict how these systems will be in place and how it will look even 20 years from now. But what's happening that I'm
Mm-hmm.
seeing is a difference where people are like, fuck this, like, no more, and actually, uprising and bringing voice, this, bringing perspective, bringing awareness to it in a way. And unfortunately, it had to go. We went through a lot of very unfortunate things to actually get to this place. um and so that's a terrible thing, and the gift in it is that there's a lot more awareness, there's a lot more activism, there's a lot more voice, there's a lot more people working to speak up and to be leaders and to bring diversity and inclusion, into all these different places. And I've seen it on both sides. Like, I see some people where it's like they really get it, and they really get the movement, and they're bringing it in from like this truest sense of like who they are as a being. And then there's this other group of people that are like, oh, we're going to bring like diversity and inclusion into our corporation, because if we don't and we get caught, then then we're going to be in trouble. So like there's this idea where you get to actually really believe it and bring in the
Mm-hmm.
cause, and then so it's other thing that's like totally in this like fear-based system. So I just encourage
Yeah, fear and shame
people to
based.
check in, like, hey, where are you actually doing this from? Like, are you just doing this to fit in and so that people don't call you out for your BS, or are you really ready to become a leader and to empower your own leadership, to empower your own voice, to stop caring about what other people think, and are you willing to actually speak up for everybody? And I think that's this place where we are, where people are like doing this dance where they're like, I don't really know how to do this because I haven't done it before. And what's great is like, what a cool place. Like, maybe it's scary, but also simultaneously, what a cool place to be. You get to create something new. You get to test out your own limitations and give grace and acceptance for like where you trip up and all this stuff. You can always be responsible and clean it up. But like, if you don't, like, we already know how that's going to go. So I just think, like, when I speak for me personally, like, I'm committed to continuing to, one, understand, two, bring empathy, three, like, speak up. And those are my commitments. Because if I know that if I continue to do that, I'm going to continue to move my needle forward, and it's going to continue to move the progress forward in any of the relationships that I have, um, just existing for me. And I think that's important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I that what you're taking from the
I
conversation?
think so. I think if I tried to say it again, it'd probably be even more long winded. But yeah, that's what I'm taking. How about you?
Um, I think I'm taking the inclusivity as a journey for all of us,
Mm-hmm.
and it may not be one that people choose into, but the like we're all being funneled into the path. So it's like, how do you want to be
Mhm.
about it? You know. So yes, that's what I'm taking from it. I mean, even for me, like inclusivity is the
Mhm.
path. There are places that I feel like I'm not as inclusive as I could
Mhm.
be, and um, and so there's work for everyone to do. There's work for everyone to do. It's not just again, it's not just race. It's there's tons of places where inclusivity can be
Yeah.
applied.
Well, even as you said that before we wrap up, it took me back to this moment about one of our earlier episodes with Adam Quiney. We were talking about love and being and like these things that from and looking at that conversation through inclusivity, that even if we're just looking at our own relationships with ourselves, like where are the parts of ourselves that we actively reject and where would we benefit from simply being inclusive, like even if it's a part of you that you don't like, by actively rejecting it, you're basically saying that it's not inclusive, it's not part of who you are, and like at the end of the day, like it is. So the more that you less judgment, less rejection,
Hmm.
and more acceptance, the the better off we'll all be, and be relating to ourselves as a whole person. I bet you that the experience of other people, like would you would have it would have you relating to other people as more whole and full human as well. um cool. Well, this is great. If you are listening to this episode and you're watching the video version, you'll notice that about 25 minutes in, Jason and I changed shirts. That's only because we had a technical breakdown a little bit ago, and we happened to be recording the tail end of this episode on a different day, which I'm really super excited about because I conversation was what it was because of what happened. So that's pretty great. Um, so this concludes our episode on inclusivity, and we have lots of other episodes that have come before this. So if you love this conversation, go back and listen to the rest of them. You can find them on Apple, on Spotify, on YouTube, or the video versions. And as always, if you've gotten something for yourself, please do send us an email. You can reach us at gentlementhepodcast at gmail.com and send us an email with what you got, what you're taking on around this, how this conversation is going to impact your life moving forward. And do hit subscribe, and you will be notified for all the upcoming episodes as we are nearing the end of season one, which we are super excited about. We have a small number of episodes. We'll be kicking back up in August. So I think that's it. Anything else from you, Jason, before we close out?
Yeah, just be sure to tune in next week for our chat with Bruce
Mm,
Reynolds as we continue our conversation around
mm,
inclusivity. He's a longtime friend and he's working on a really big initiative, so we're super excited to support him in his
mm.
creation.
Awesome. Yes, super excited for that. So, all right, everybody, we will wrap up and see you on the next episode.